And I just want to say it is a real pleasure to welcome Peter Slevin to Politics and Prose. He'll be talking tonight about his new book, Michelle Obama, A Life. Many of you probably know that Peter's a seasoned journalist, a real pro, very well suited to write this biography. He served on the national staff of the Washington Post for many years, covered the Obamas at various points when he was in Chicago as a bureau chief for the Post, and has also covered other political campaigns. He's currently an associate professor at the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. And I did joke to Peter ahead of time. I worked, as some of you may know, that I worked for many years for Hillary Clinton when she was First Lady. So I joked to him that having been on the inside of this sort of operation, I really admire anyone who attempts to write anything about a First Lady, let alone a book. And he quickly replied, "Oh, and you must think that because you were so forthcoming in those days." So touche. But I just, speaking of Hillary Clinton, I do want to say that it does somehow seem fitting that you're here 24 hours after a former First Lady has declared her 2016 presidential campaign. Not that Michelle Obama has any plans at the moment to run for office herself, unless you have some breaking news you want to share with us. No? Okay. So she will, well, you never know. Anyway, tonight we're going to learn a lot more about Mrs. Obama through Peter's insights from his reporting. Quite a bit has been written about her life, her childhood in Chicago, her Ivy League education, her career as a lawyer, her efforts to navigate the very tricky landscape of the White House since her husband was elected president in 2008. I think what makes this book special and different is that Peter was willing to really examine very deeply the eras, the places, the cultural contexts that shaped Mrs. Obama's life. He talks a lot about the role of race in her life, and really gets to the forces that shaped her ideas, her approaches, her aspirations, really her worldview, and that have continued to guide her in a job that, frankly, she never really expected, I think, or wanted to have. He calls her the unlikeliest First Lady in modern history, first African-American woman to find herself in a role that is, and I do know this from experience too, even under the best of circumstances, impossibly hard. There is no job description, there is no guidebook, there are no rules, and yet everyone, it seems, has a strong opinion about what the First Lady, their First Lady, should do, say, wear, how they should look, how they should act. And it's a somewhat fraught environment, but in that fraught environment, the First Lady must somehow stay true to herself and chart her own course. And that's exactly what Mrs. Obama has done so very, very successfully and effectively. Peter's written a fascinating and insightful book. It tells us not only about Mrs. Obama, but also a lot about our country and the times in which we live. It is truly a pleasure to welcome him to Politics and Prose.
I'm not really sure I have anything to add to that. That pretty much sums it up. And Lissa knows this world better than I will ever know it, having been on the inside long before Mrs. Obama was in the White House. I have to say, it is a thrill to be here. This is my local bookstore. We lived in Tenleytown for a long time and came here, brought the kids here. Oh, is this not working? Up? Down. It's not working. Closer. Closer? Is this better? This is an interesting perspective. I will try that. Is that better? Yes. Okay, sorry. So let me say again, this was our local bookstore. We lived in Tenleytown until we went off to Chicago 10 years ago, and we come back often. My mother is here, I'm thrilled to say, sitting in the front row, so this is kind of neat for me. It's great to see so many friends. Really, really terrific. 10 years ago, if you had asked me what book I might write someday if I were to write a book, I'm confident that writing a book about a First Lady, an American First Lady, would not have been among the top 100 choices. I was covering national security and foreign policy for the Washington Post, in fact, with Brad Graham, who sat next to me. We sat next to each other for a couple of years when I moved to Chicago. And I moved to Chicago because of my wife, Kate Macer, a terrific historian of American history who got a job at Northwestern University teaching. And so off I went, and I thought, Chicago, what could happen in Chicago? I've been writing about the Iraq War, which there was some news there after all. And It happened to be 2004, and a certain guy with a funny name had just given a certain speech to a certain audience at Faneuil Hall. And it was Barack Obama who was running for the Senate at that point, as luck would have it. So there I was working for the Post in 07 and 08 when that same Barack Obama decided to run for the presidency, this remarkably audacious move. And I spent a great deal of time traveling with him and writing deeper stories about Barack Obama and Michelle Obama, who played such a key role in that campaign. And I found her, of course, fascinating. And I thought Michelle Obama is someone who should be at the center of her own narrative sometimes, not just wife of. So I had covered a lot of high-profile stuff and a lot of high-pressure stories in D.C., but I have to tell you, as Lissa alluded to, while trying to write about the First Lady of the United States and her husband, the President, while they were in office, I thought, this has to be nuts. This cannot be in any way a good idea. So why did I do it? And the reason is, Michelle Obama is a remarkable story. I don't need to tell any of you that. She, from her family history to her experiences to the places she has come from and risen to, I felt it was a story that was worth telling. And I wanted to understand her purpose and her depth because she has a lot of both. And as Lissa said, the outlines of her life are pretty familiar, but it turns out there's an awful lot we really don't know about her, her career, her trajectory. And I wanted to find out what she was doing and saying. We know some of that, but why? What is it that has driven Michelle Obama to be the First Lady she is? Why is she choosing these initiatives, and do they add up to something extra, something special? And I think the answer certainly is yes, and I came up, I think, with a different understanding of who she is. And I wanted to do something else, as Lissa said. I wanted to write about Michelle Obama against the backdrop of the history that she has lived. Remember that Michelle Obama was born in 1964, the year that the Civil Rights Act was passed. Remember, too, that what Chicago was like back then. This is the Chicago of Richard J. Daley. And I should say this book is firmly anchored in Chicago. It is not a Washington book, although the last number of chapters are certainly about her White House career. She came of age in the first post-civil rights generation, and I wanted to try to figure out, what does that mean? She had opportunities and ambitions, too, that her parents could never have imagined, and in fact didn't share except on her behalf, because things were possible that had not been possible before. And if you've listened to Michelle Obama, you know that she sometimes refers to herself as a statistical anomaly. She'll say, I am not supposed to be here. She has said that several different times in her life, and I wanted to understand that. She talks about her own self-doubt. Now, we think of her as striding through life, and of course she does. I mean, she's hula hooping on the White House lawn. She's got some confidence, shall we say. But she is very open. In fact, in public, if you look hard enough, in talking about what she feels has held her back and what drives her. There's a pretty powerful story here. And I've found along the way that Barack Obama has had some thoughts. He said not only was he attracted to her because she was gorgeous and brilliant, but also that he saw a certain vulnerability, a certain humanity in her that intrigued him and that fascinated him. And I thought I would try to tell a little bit of her story through just 3 sort of short readings that I hope will get at, sort of suggest where she's coming from and what she's trying to do. Let me start by reading just a small bit of the introduction, really right from the beginning, because Michelle Obama came to Washington, and she said, I want to be part of the community. I will get out of the White House. I will also open the White House to people like me, people who came, who have a similar background to me and weren't welcomed into America's institutions the way I hope to do that. So the book begins. In June 2010, when Michelle Obama cast her eyes across the class of graduating high school seniors from one of Washington's most troubled black neighborhoods, she saw not only their lives, but her own. The setting was Constitution Hall, and you'll immediately know what that means, where the Daughters of the American Revolution had prevented opera singer Marian Anderson from performing in 1939 because she was black. So much had changed in 7 decades, and yet much had not. Michelle spoke to the graduates about the troubles facing African American children in Anacostia, and she spoke about racism. She pointed out that the neighborhood within sight of the U.S. Capitol once was segregated, and that black people had been prohibited from owning property in parts of the community. And she said, even after those barriers were torn down, others emerged. These are her words: poverty, violence, inequality. Michelle drew a straight line from her struggles with hardship and self-doubt in working-class Chicago to the fractured world the Anacostia students inhabited 30 years later. She told them about being written off, about feeling rejected, about the resilience it takes for a black kid in a public school to become one of the first in her family to go to college. Quote, kids teasing me when I studied hard, teachers telling me not to reach too high because my test scores weren't good enough, folks making it clear with what they said or didn't say that success wasn't meant for a little girl like me from the south side of Chicago. As she spoke of her parents, their sacrifices, and the way they pushed her to reach for a life they never knew, her words, her voice broke and tears came to her eyes. As the students applauded in support, Michelle went on, and if Barack were here, he'd say the same thing was true for him. He'd tell you it was hard at times growing up without a father. He'd tell you that his family didn't have a lot of money. He'd tell you that he made plenty of mistakes and wasn't always the best student. She knew that many of the Anacostia students faced disruptions and distractions that sometimes made it hard to show up, much less succeed. It might be family turmoil or money troubles or needy relatives or children of their own. Or maybe the lack of a mentor, a quiet place to study, a lucky break. Quote, maybe you feel like no one has your back, like you've been let down by people so many times that you've stopped believing in yourself. Maybe you feel like your destiny was written the day you were born, and you ought to just rein in your hopes and scale back your dreams. But if any of you are thinking that way, I am here to say, stop it. There were no cheap lines in Michelle's speech that day, 17 months after she arrived in the White House as the unlikeliest First Lady in modern history. In a voice entirely her own, she reached deep into a lifetime of thinking about race, politics, and power to deliver a message about inequity and perseverance, challenge and uplift. These were the themes and experiences that animated her and set her apart. No one who looked like Michelle Obama had ever occupied the White House. No one who acted quite like her either. She ran obstacle courses, she danced the Dougie, she hula hooped on the White House lawn. She opened the executive mansion to fresh faces and voices and took her show on the road. She did sitcoms and talk shows and participated in cyber showcases and social media almost as soon as they were invented. Cameras and microphones tracked her every move. Maddening though the attention could be, she tried to make it useful. Amid a characteristic media fuss about a new hairstyle, she said of First Ladies, "We take our bangs and we stand in front of important things that the world needs to see. And eventually, people stop looking at the bangs and they start looking at what we're standing in front of." Michelle Obama invokes the power of her own trajectory all the time. Her audiences most often are, these days especially, are disadvantaged kids, often in urban neighborhoods. She doesn't speak at Princeton and Harvard, even though she went there. She speaks at Bowie State and Arkansas State and the University of California at Merced and Oregon State. She feels that she can deliver a message that will resonate, she hopes, and she is about unstacking the deck in some small way, I think. And I think when she was choosing what projects to pursue in the White House, she reached into her own upbringing and experience and thought about what spoke to her. And she's at her best, as many of us are, when she is doing the things that she cares about. I think we see that in the White House with what she has very, very carefully chosen. And what she wants, what she chooses are projects that feel purposeful. I write about it in the book that she's trying in a small way to unstack the deck. She's about inequality and fairness, which interestingly enough, both of them are talking about both of the Obamas are talking about much more in the second term. You'll remember, because we know the outlines of her story, that she went to Princeton and she went to Harvard and she graduated from Harvard Law School, and she went to work for a corporate law firm. She went to work for Sidley and Austin, in Chicago, where she met Barack Obama, but it didn't speak to her. It wasn't a place where she felt particularly comfortable, although it certainly helped her start to pay off her big student loans. And she left after 3 years, and she went to City Hall, and she was hired into that job by Valerie Jarrett, interestingly enough, who later would open the door for Michelle Obama at the University of Chicago, where Michelle spent 12 years. Keeping in mind that Michelle Obama had a 20-year professional career in Chicago before she had to give it up and come to Washington. 10 of those years as a working mother. But the job that meant the most to her, she now says, was a job at a place called Public Allies. It was an AmeriCorps program that she started from scratch, the Chicago branch, in 1993. And Public Allies was a project, it was a leadership training program where Michelle would choose 30 to 40 people, young people, diverse young people, group of young people a year, and teach them, mentor them, guide them into internships in government agencies and in nonprofits. And she said that it was the thing that she looked back on that was entirely her own and entirely meaningful to her. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about her in this part of her life. This is, so in 1993, she was not quite 30 when she took this on. Jackie Grimshaw, a former Harold Washington aide, was one of the board members who interviewed Michelle. Grimshaw's first impression, boy, she's tall. Michelle is 5'11". Michelle spoke confidently about how to structure and administer the program and how to connect with young people from a wide array of backgrounds. She was quick to smile, said Grimshaw. She was very personable. She had that warm personality, which was what we were looking for. We were talking about young persons who needed guidance, and we needed a young person to be their leader. She was the perfect fit. Grimshaw also felt sure that anyone admitted to the Chicago program would see that Michelle was direct. There would be no trifling. As Michelle developed the leadership training and community organizing components of Public Allies, she drew on the ideas of John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann, Northwestern University faculty members who had spotted a flaw in the way outsiders typically perceived the neighborhoods they were trying to help. And see if you can hear in this description from 20 years ago some of the notes that Michelle sounds to this day. As they saw it, do-gooders too often do-gooders too often failed to appreciate the abilities of the people they were trying to help, and too rarely drew on them for solutions. Calling their model ABCD, for asset-based community development, they said solutions needed to be crafted from the inside out and the ground up. Projects should build on neighborhood efforts in order to avoid becoming beholden to outsiders, their theories, and their money. A goal was self-reliance. Only if the project were practical and made sense to the residents would it be sustainable, and only if it were sustainable would it make the neighborhood stronger. Michelle introduced these concepts to allies she recruited from across Chicago, adopting a training manual published by McKnight and Kretzmann. Each ally received a copy during Core Week when the concepts were introduced and the coaching and team building began. The manual proposed ways of asking questions and listening, an approach considered preferable to marching into a neighborhood to prescribe and command. It emphasized outreach to residents who had ideas and energy but did not carry the label of community leader that, of course, we see in the media all the time. Successful workers would recognize a suffering neighborhood as a glass half empty, but work with it as a glass half full. They would see assets, in other words, not just deficits. Kretzmann met for coffee with Michelle as she developed her curriculum. He saw how the theories resonated with her understanding of Chicago's black neighborhoods. Once the allies were on board, Michelle recognized how much she enjoyed the mentoring and the teaching side of the job, recalling the role that elders had played in her own life and the importance of reaching back, just as she had discussed in her Princeton thesis and all those conversations at Harvard. It all fit. My mom and dad would always say that if just a few people would come back and live in the community, it would make all the difference in the world, Michelle said. We talked about that a lot. Now, if Michelle had only been seeking diversity of palate, she could have chosen well-mannered candidates of varying complexions from comfortable middle-class households. That would have been the path taken by a person, quote, who just wants to look like they're doing well, said Joby Peterson Cates, a white Northwestern graduate. But that was not Michelle's approach. She would always take risks, said Cates, on kids from lower-income neighborhoods, and in Chicago, that correlates with race, just to make sure that they got a chance. She was willing to drive them hard and take extra time, in addition to being executive director, to push these guys. These aren't easy guys to work with. Cates continued, the people who had privilege coming into the program, she didn't encourage us any less. She didn't push us any less hard. But I got the sense that part of her mission in life was to push all these incredible people not to be left behind, not to let their lives go. She was hard on them, but she also didn't kick them out. Michelle attracted young allies from DePaul University and the University of Chicago and a few from Harvard Law, but also from housing projects such as Cabrini Green and tough neighborhoods like Little Village and North Lawndale, where the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had tried nearly 30 years earlier to expose the wrongs of poverty and discrimination. Some allies came equipped with only a high school equivalency degree. A few had criminal pasts. Many had trouble at home and little experience with high standards. Quote, "She didn't care if you were one of the cool kids. She cared if you were one of the kids who really wanted it," said Cates, a member of Michelle's first public allies class. She would pick the one on the edge of her seat. It had nothing to do with intellect or breeding, but that they were itching to get going. That quality of enthusiasm and earnestness was more important than just about anything else. In bringing a wide range of people together, one of Michelle's essential goals was to teach them to walk in unfamiliar worlds, a challenge for sheltered and unsheltered young people alike. "There's nothing funnier," she once said, "than to watch a kid who believes they know it all actually come across some real tough problems in communities that test every fiber of what they believe." On the flip side, she said, nothing was finer than to see a kid without a high school diploma sit with college students and realize that his ideas are just as good, sometimes even better. Beth Ann Hester, a white woman who started as an ally and then joined the staff, recalled that, quote, "The most powerful thing she ever taught me was to be constantly aware of my privilege. Michelle reminded me that it's too easy to go and sit with your own. She can invite you in a kind of aggressive way to be all that you can be." Michelle did that job for 3 years. Before she moved on to to the University of Chicago, where she did community service. And she worked in Chicago neighborhoods for the rest of her career before she ended up, the rest of her career, she was in her 40s, before Barack embarked on the quest for the presidency. And she was trying to connect those worlds. That was her goal. And I think when we think about Michelle Obama's experiences, we can understand the messages that she sent on the campaign trail that we've all heard so much of and around the country. And I think it helps us understand, too, what she meant when she said at the very beginning of this whole national enterprise in 2007, when she said, Michelle and Barack Obama are not that unusual. You just haven't seen us before. And of course, to that she meant white audiences who were experiencing prominent black politician and his wife in a brand new way. She did have this really important professional career. She then had to reinvent herself in a role that, as Lissa said, doesn't have a playbook. There are plenty of role models, but you're kind of on your own when you get there. Expectations are through the roof, and they are conflicting. It is deeply complicated to walk that line, and she had the added burden of not having lived a political life after all. And obviously it was a role that, as Lissa said, she did not seek, and then it was a realm that she did not particularly enjoy. So she arrives in the White House in 2009, and she tries to find her way, and it was rough, as her aides and friends told me. It was a tough transition, but of course it is for anyone, after all, for any First Lady, as you can understand. And she was trying to find her way, trying to find what spoke to her, what purpose she could achieve, and how she could fulfill her ambition, which is to make something of a difference. She found that direction, I would argue, on a visit first to Anacostia High. This was before her commencement speech, which was another year later. And she found that her message and her story translated, but it really clicked when she took her first foreign trip. You'll remember probably in 2009 when she went to England on her first trip, and she wore a cardigan to meet the Queen, and she put her arm around the Queen, which apparently one does not do. One offers a proffered hand, perhaps, or shakes a proffered hand. The Queen didn't seem to mind, by the way, although the gadflies did buzz. And she went to speak at a girls' school in Islington, North London, the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson School. And it was home to girls from 55 different countries, in whom she saw some of herself. And she gave her talk, and she found that the things she had been saying on the south side of Chicago and the things that she had been saying to kids she had mentored through the years worked here too. So let me finish by just reading a very short passage about that speech. Nothing in my life would ever have predicted that I would be standing here as the first African-American First Lady. I was not raised with wealth or resources or any social standing to speak of, she told the girls. I was raised on the south side of Chicago. That's the real part of Chicago, she told the girls. I want you to know that we have very much in common. Echoing her remarks at Anacostia High 2 weeks earlier, she declared that, quote, confidence and fortitude would win out. You too can control your own destiny. Please remember that. As she spoke, the girls cheered and Michelle choked up. When she ended her remarks, she surprised them by announcing, I do hugs. The girls flocked around her and she delivered one embrace after another. Afterward, feeling invigorated, she climbed into her car and she said, I could do that all day. It was not much of a stretch to say that Michelle had found her métier in words and gestures. Her story connected with the girls, and so did her familiar, affirming embrace. In the White House, a hug would become her signature, natural and abiding, a sign of faith and support. She was not yet certain about the contours of the bully pulpit, nor had she decided which issues to pursue, but a hug was one concrete thing that she could make happen. With a smile, a few words, an embrace, she would try to convey to thousands of girls and boys that the First Lady of the United States believed in them. As for the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson School, she stayed in touch. She arranged to meet 35 students at Oxford 2 years later, and she hosted 12 students at the White House in 2012. On her desk, she kept a photograph of her visit to the school. Michelle made a point of speaking to young audiences when she visited India, Africa, and Latin America during her first 2 years in office. And you may have noticed that she was recently in Cambodia, giving a very similar talk. East Wing staffers who asked State Department and National Security Council colleagues how the First Lady could be useful hoped her ability to connect with diverse young people overseas might even deliver a small foreign policy benefit. At a time when the United States was waging a global competition for hearts and minds, she told university students in Mexico City in April 2010 that, quote, the immense promise of an internet-connected generation had persuaded her to make young people the focus of her international efforts. Nearly half of Mexico's population was younger than 25, she noted, while in the Middle East the figure was 60%. She called it a youth bulge, and she made clear that the status quo would not suffice. Quote, you have an unprecedented ability to organize and to mobilize and to challenge old assumptions and to bridge old divides and to find new solutions to our toughest problems, she said. Organize, mobilize, challenge, bridge, through the prism of assets, not deficits. She told her staff, don't just put me on a plane, send me someplace and have me smile. She was finding her voice, and the challenge was to make it matter. And that was Michelle in 2010, and now we're 5 years later, amazingly. Her legacy, I think, isn't written. She's still got a couple of years to go. But it seems very clear that part of her legacy will be this message that she is trying to share, a message that is very complex, after all, but a message that she feels deeply and that connects very much with who she is, where she came from, and what she experienced along the way. I think it's going to be quite fascinating to see where she takes that after she leaves the White House. So thank you for listening. I'd love to talk, answer questions. It's kind of interesting. She's planning to do some writing, and she says that she wants to work on education, which she calls the greatest civil rights challenge of this generation. So we'll see exactly what that will turn out to be.
And if you have a question and can make it to a mic, that would be great. But since nobody's getting up there yet, I have a question. And in the book, Peter, you, and I guess we're sort of aware of this just watching her, she's very disciplined and very restrained. She's very careful, it seems, to make her points and make them forcefully, but not to offend, which is a pretty smart thing for a First Lady, because obviously you can get a lot of trouble if you offend anybody. But there are also allusions in the book that you cite to her kind of gearing up for some pretty honest talk once she's out of there. Could you talk about that a little bit? And am I right in interpreting what I think I read?
That is certainly what she has told her friends. She has there were some friends who were with her not too many months ago, and she joked, kind of catching them by surprise. She said, when I'm out of here, I am going to be just like Barbara Bush. And people think, Barbara Bush. And somebody said, well, you mean the 3 strands of pearls? And she says, no, when I'm out of here, I am going to say whatever I want. it is clear that Michelle Obama and Barack Obama feel so very constrained by the bubble, the so-called bubble that they live in. I mean, just last week she was asked what she would want to do if she could. She said, you know what I'd like to do? I would like to drive down the street in the car with the window down. Because they drive the car called the Beast that's 7.5 tons. The car is sealed from the outside. The doors are as big as airplane doors. They keep a supply of Barack Obama's blood type in the back. And if there's a chemical attack, they can seal it against outside air. She said going on a date night in the motorcade, not very fun, not very romantic. 20 cars, the police, the guys with guns, which is one of the reasons, by the way, they tend to stay in. You know, she learned a hard lesson, I think it's fair to say, during that first campaign. She had veto power, her friends say, over Barack's decision to run for the presidency in late 2006. And she said, I took myself down every dark road I could imagine, and I laid out, I tried to understand everything we would go through, even though, gosh, how could that have even been possible? I think, as Gwen Eiffel has said, they couldn't have known what they were really getting themselves into. But one of the things that was very important to Michelle Obama in going out on the campaign trail, where she was in, you know, she was determined. Once Barack was running, she was on his side, and she wanted to make it happen. She wanted to be true to herself. She wanted to tell her own story and Barack's own story, and that played very well with an awful lot of voters because she was so real. And you ask her a direct question, and she gives you a direct answer. And she told stories about how she sees the world, and she sees the world. Frankly, at a time when there is gross inequality, she talked about inequality. But you'll recall in February of 2008 when she said, well, for the first time in my adult life, I'm proud of my country. Now, an awful lot of people knew exactly what that meant. A guy named Barack Hussein Obama was in the process of winning 10 primaries and caucuses in a row. But of course, she was hammered for it by an awful lot of people who were her critics. And I think, in answer to Lissa's question, she learned from that she did have to bite her tongue. And interestingly enough, many people who were close to her said she was kind of mortified. I mean, because not so much that the criticism itself, although that was painful, but at the thought that maybe she had damaged Barack's chances of getting into the White House. And so she got to the White House and understood, according to her staff, that her first mission was to do no harm. And while she had all kinds of things she would love to say and do, she had to, in a very strategic way, figure out what she could do, what she could say, and what she couldn't. Now, I think it's pretty clear in measured ways that she is speaking out more in the second term. I think, frankly, he is too. And I think it's going to be, when I say that her legacy is not fully written, it really is 2 more years. I think a lot could still happen. But I think one of the luxuries of time and of having 4 years to work on this after so many years on deadline was the chance to read so much of what she has written and said. Hundreds of thousands of words I've read of hers, and one can get a very clear sense of Michelle Obama's thinking simply by listening to her.
Anybody have questions? Because if not, I can keep going. But I want you guys to ask questions. Here we go.
Yeah, so being first at the microphone, I guess that gives me certain rights. I have 2 questions. One is sort of a simple one and direct. When she made that change from the program, I forgot the name, but the program...
Public Allies.
Yeah, that she established in Chicago, to the University of Chicago. Did you gain in your interviewing and such any information about why she made that change or have a sense of the reason for that from a program where you characterized it as being so close to her heart?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great question that is not fully answered. I think she had been chief cook and bottle washer for 3 years. I think that was tough on her and on their family. And I think it was quite fascinating what she did to build that. I mean, she not only was doing the fun part of mentoring these young people, she also raised money. And in less than 2 years, her budget was $1.1 million in a year. So it was pretty tough work. And I think when she got to the University of Chicago, one of the intriguing things was she was on the inside, and she talked about her ability to work in both worlds. There's a woman named Sunny Fisher who was on the board at Public Allies, and she remembered the going away party for Michelle when she was leaving, and she recalled how Michelle was emotional about what she was leaving behind, but that Sonny Fisher said, I always felt that she needed a bigger arena. She needed to do more. And I think one way to look at it is Michelle taking step after step into bigger and bigger challenges, doing bigger and bigger challenges, very much the way Barack Obama was doing at exactly the same time. And I think if you look at their relationship and their choices in the 90s, it's a fascinating window into who they have become and what they're doing now.
Thank you. And then the second question is, of course, we've had first ladies who were part of a wealthy family, came from wealthy backgrounds, and then after the presidency, they continue to be wealthy, usually not as young as, she will be when she leaves. So when she leaves, she will, I think, for the first time in her life, also be presumably financially, personally independent because of the opportunities to write, to be on boards and things of that sort. Do you have any sort of sense or projection of how that liberation, both from the White House and also financially, might play out for her in her life?
Yeah, I think in terms of the liberation from the White House, it will be a very freeing moment. When you think about what had to happen starting in early 2007, in February, when Barack Obama announced for the presidency, she had to move away from her own individual identity. She had to forge a new one, and it was the last time, it's now been 8 years, where she was really fully separate from him. And I think it's going to be intriguing to see what she does next. I don't think that the financial part is a huge part of it. I mean, in 2007, he had book royalties coming in, and they made $4.7 million, though, of course, they were at that point in the middle of the campaign. They will certainly be loaded. I think that is safe to say, just from their books. Andrew Wiley, the book agent, was quoted in a piece by David Remnick guessing that she might make $13 million for her advance. He might make 17 to 20 million. Now, who knows? But money will not be a problem. I do think the intriguing part will be whether she continues to feel a sense of obligation and purpose that is so very consistent as a theme throughout her life. I suspect she will, but I believe her when she also says, because she's asked this question from time to time, that she doesn't know exactly what she'll be doing. Yes.
And excuse me, all the research that you did on Michelle, what did you find that surprised you, and what might we be surprised to hear about her?
It's an interesting question that in a way I think requires a nuanced answer, because in some ways we know Michelle's story, don't we? As Lissa said, we know the general outlines. She didn't make stuff up to pretend that she was somebody that she wasn't. But in going into the details, I was completely intrigued by a number of things, not least her family background and what it meant to her. She comes from a very large, very close family on the south side of Chicago. Her family was geographically close, as well as close as relatives. And I'm intrigued by the role model she had. She was very, very close to her father, her late father, and of course her mother lives in the White House. Her grandfathers were important players in her life. And it was intriguing to go find some of her relatives and hear their story. So I was a little surprised that I went looking for one of her cousins, and he's a rabbi. He has converted to Judaism, and I found him at his temple, and I said, "Hi, I'm this guy. I'm writing a book about your cousin. Can we talk?" And he said, "Okay." He then led me to Michelle's uncle, her father's next youngest brother, Nomini Robinson. Nomini Robinson graduated from Hyde Park High in the class of 1955. Seymour Hersh was a classmate, if you all remember, the investigative reporter. And he got to go to college, unlike Michelle's father. And in 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running for the presidency, you might remember in Michigan, he gave a speech about how there ought to be something like a Peace Corps. Nomini Robinson thought this sounded pretty good, and he wrote to the president and said, "I'd like to be in the Peace Corps when you have one." And he went through the process. He was picked for the Peace Corps. I found, this is possibly the most unexpected discovery, I found a photograph in a 1962 copy of the New York Times of Nomini Robinson, Michelle's uncle, with Jackie Kennedy in India, where he was in the Peace Corps and she was there, and he was the Peace Corps volunteer who was designated to guide him along. This was before Nomini Robinson graduated from Harvard Business School. She has an intriguing set of relatives. She has a great aunt. The family grew up in a top floor of a bungalow where they moved. They basically were able to move in 1965 because of white flight. And her great aunt and great uncle owned the place, and the Robinsons lived upstairs. Well, Aunt Robbie Shields, the woman who owned the house with her husband, who was a Pullman porter, I learned in 1942 was the choir director, the youth choir director at Woodlawn AME, which was the most progressive black church in Chicago at the time. In fact, they hosted a national conference of Congress of Core. This church was invited by Northwestern University to send a representative to a summer choir workshop. And they sent Robbie Shields. She arrives on the campus of Northwestern University, and they say, well, you can attend the workshop, but you can't sleep here. We don't allow people like you to sleep on this campus. And at that time, Northwestern, in fact, granted degrees to African Americans, but they couldn't spend the night on campus. Well, Robbie Shields said, this is all very interesting. She calls Pastor Carey, who was the pastor of AME, Woodlawn AME, who calls somebody at the Chicago Defender, who calls somebody at a predecessor of the ACLU, and they march back up to Evanston, Illinois, and talk to the people who had made this decision, who said, well, of course we made this decision. You wouldn't be comfortable here, of course. She sued Northwestern University for discrimination. So Michelle Obama comes from a close family. I'm sorry, I don't know, because I couldn't find the records. That's a great question. Believe me, I tried. I don't know. But I did check with Michelle Obama's relatives to make sure that, just to see if this was discussed. And her great aunt said, or rather her aunt said, well, of course we talked about it. We talked about this all around the house. And this was true. These conversations went on in their household, and of course they did. But it was fascinating to learn about her family. And there are many other characters who are just great, including, by the way, her mother, who might be the most interesting character in the whole book. So thank you for that question. Yes.
Peter, programmatically, the one area that she's particularly well known for is nutrition, and particularly children's nutrition. But that didn't take long for her to be slammed for that and accused of a nanny state. And, if the president was a Kenyan socialist, she was the embodiment of the nanny state and so on. Was she surprised by that pushback? And as a reporter, I'd like what your take on it is.
To wonder whether anything can surprise her now after what she has been through. I think it's pretty unlikely. And she actually wrote an op-ed in the Times and said, if you can believe it, the Republicans are even after me on this. She finds it pretty much ridiculous. And I think it is important. I mean, you all have seen on Twitter, hashtag thank you Michelle Obama with some just ghastly looking school lunch. It's important to remember the 2010 Nutrition Act was passed on a bipartisan basis. It was actually a bill that Republicans and Democrats voted for. The standards were developed by a nonpartisan wing of NIH. These were not Michelle Obama's, she wasn't the scientist in there saying this is what this should be. And I also think that when you think of the school lunch part of it, I think sometimes it's not fully appreciated who eats those lunches and how that might tie in to what Michelle Obama cares about. 70% of the 30 million school lunches that are eaten each day in U.S. schools are eaten by children or purchased by children who cannot afford to pay full price. So one thing it is safe to say about Michelle Obama and her interest in school lunches is she wants some nutrition, of course, for all kids, but particularly, she's pointing out, kids who most need it. As a reporter, as a writer of this book, I was, I think you could say, shocked but not surprised by the depth of the vitriol that she faces day in and day out. And it's not just in the comment sections, which are just, unpoliced and just dramatically bad. And it's not just political polarization, because she's a Democrat and a lot of people don't like these Democrats who are in the White House. A lot of it has to do with race, and by race I mean racism. And the evidence is crystal clear. When you look at, in the book I write about this because I think it's important to remember Michelle Obama is, like every other first lady, trying to make a difference in her own way in an impossible job. Doesn't get paid, she doesn't have any constitutional responsibility. She couldn't go out and get another job and walk away from this if she did. And look what she gets. So I focused, I told stories of Republicans, they happen to be Republican men, criticizing Michelle Obama or sending around photoshopped pictures or making crude jokes with their names attached. Like, no big deal. Gee, there's a photo that's gone around from National Geographic of a gathering of tribal women in Africa who are topless, and Republican elected official says, Michelle Obama's high school reunion. That's what she puts up with. So compared with that, getting a little criticism because she's trying to shift things around a little bit on nutrition, my guess is she's not really surprised.
Peter.
Yes, sure. Hi.
Hi. So, what is your guess on how valuable Michelle is going to be, how much she's going to volunteer for the Hillary campaign here?
Yeah, Lissa, I would like to yield on that one.
And is she going to be, is she going to be gung-ho and be out there and campaigning in states where she's needed, or is there some little animosity between them, and she'll be just asked to do what she...
Yeah, it's a very fair question, and I'm quite keen on not talking about things that I don't know particularly well. I mean, I think it is highly likely that Michelle and Barack Obama would like to see a Democrat elected and will help. Do I have inside knowledge of how far she will go? I don't. But think about how she has been a very, not just sort of loyal soldier, I think, for the Democratic Party, but think how she was an extraordinary fundraiser. She is in great demand, and I'm sure she still will be. I would be surprised if she just stayed home. But again, I don't have independent knowledge of that one.
Thank you.
Peter, can I just say one thing?
Of course, please.
It is an interesting question, and I think it's something that people love to speculate about. And one thing that I think people often forget is that there are very, very few people who have occupied these positions who actually appreciate what it's like. And by virtue of that alone, they tend to be very understanding of each other, sympathetic to each other. They give each other a lot of space to do the things the way they need to do. And while the campaign in 2008 was obviously bitter and brutal, what came out of it was that Hillary Clinton went to work for Barack Obama. Barack Obama was big enough and I would say smart enough to ask her, and she was big enough and smart enough to accept. And they had a partnership. He commented on it yesterday in pretty glowing terms. When Mrs. Obama first arrived at the White House, she invited Hillary over so that they could talk about the whole issue of how do you raise kids in the White House. And so an awful lot happens behind the scenes because this is such a rare experience that most people just can't possibly relate to. And so with that few number of people who've been there, they tend to lean on each other in ways that the no offense, the press and certainly the public, it's not as entertaining. It's much more entertaining if there's a cat fight, or they don't really like each other, or they're going to hold a grudge for 8 or 10 years. And as Peter said, they are spending an awful lot of their own personal capital on certain issues and policies, and making an awful lot of sacrifices out of a vision for the country that, by the way, they pretty much share. And they're not just going to squander that over, I really didn't like that person 8 years ago. I didn't like what they said on the campaign. So I would just echo what you're saying. I think you're going to see Barack Obama out there, and I would guess you're going to see Michelle Obama out there. And I don't think it's going to be twisting elbows to be there.
It was interesting, too, in seeking advice on how to be First Lady and how to just manage this bizarre world that they inhabit, not least how to create some zone of normality for their daughters. We should also keep in mind that when Michelle Obama said she was mom in chief, part of it was to create a bit of a buffer zone while she figured things out. Part of it is she considers her role as mom to be more important than anything else she's doing. And she consulted with every living First Lady, she has said, when she got to the White House. And the one piece of advice on which they all agreed, go to Camp David as often as possible. get out, go for hikes, go someplace where you can actually put the windows down.
This gentleman has been waiting
Yes.
extremely patiently for way too long. I'm so sorry.
I was enjoying it.
Thank you.
But the previous comment was a perfect segue to my second question. But my first question is I'm always amused when a white dude writes about his sister.
Doesn't happen that
So I
often.
wanted to know, how you felt, or there were times when you felt a little queasy
It's a great question. and
about
an
writing
important
about
one.
a black woman.
Absolutely.
Because you probably get some raised eyebrows. Second question is very close to the previous comment.
Mm-hmm.
How similar or similar are Hillary and Michelle? Because
Right.
neither one of them came from money. And they met their husbands as they were forging a career.
Right.
And
Interesting.
they went on
yeah.
to prominence.
Mhm.
And so I just see some stark similarities there. And it's like iron sharpening iron, And so her comments about that respect, because they've both been there. And I just wanted to get your views.
Sure, those are
on-
both great questions, really important questions. Let me take the first one first. What it is to be a white man writing about a black woman. I was on Melissa Harris Perry's show over the weekend, and it was her first question. And she said, can a white man tell a true story about Michelle Obama? And of course I said, that is not for me to say. I hope so. And I thought about that question every day I worked on this book. How did I go about it? Well, I'd been a reporter for 30 years, writing about people who were not me, by definition. And the way I did that, the way I worked as a newspaper reporter for the Washington Post and the Miami Herald, was I started with questions and not answers. And I talked to as many people as I could talk to, and I listened really hard, and I challenged my assumptions all the time. And in this particular case, I worked on this book for more than 4 years. I interviewed dozens upon dozens of people who, I am so grateful, trusted me with their stories. And I thought about it a lot, and until the moment I pressed the button for the last time in February, I did in fact challenge my assumptions and tried real hard to get it right. Now, I don't imagine this is the only book that's ever going to be written about Michelle Obama. What I do hope is that it will be part of a long-running conversation about who she is, where she came from, and I really welcome a whole bunch of other perspectives on this particularly complex and I think particularly fascinating woman. On your second question, I would probably quibble just a bit that they come from similar backgrounds. I mean, they did, of course, both come from Chicago. Hillary was better off. She came from, that's right, she came from just across the line, but I mean the Chicago area, came from the suburbs. She was a Republican. When she got to Wellesley, she was head of the college Republicans at the time. And I think without sort of trying to fathom the differences in their relationships, think a little bit, I think, about how they were as first ladies. Hillary set out to do something far more ambitious than Michelle Obama ever contemplated when she tried to run healthcare policy. And Michelle Obama and her staff, one of the things they determined very, very early was, we are not going to do that. We are not going to be involved in policy. Michelle Obama was not going to be Rosalind Carter sitting in on cabinet meetings. She was not going to be Eleanor Roosevelt, who looked for a federal job while she was there, and so forth. So they have taken a very different approach to their roles in the White House, I think, even though what they do share is a very fancy bit of schooling, some work as lawyers, and having impressive professional careers before they got
What
there.
about personalities?
Personalities, I think they are, in many ways, they're very different, would be my thought. And when you think about Michelle Obama and who she is, she has a very careful, very clearly thought out sense of herself and the role that she wants to play. And she does nothing until she is entirely ready. And I think in the White House, you can find a real consistency in what she has done. And I think with Hillary Clinton, and Listen really knows this story much better, she did this very, very ambitious thing, and then was overtaken by events in a certain number of situations, and her activism, if you want to call it that, was more episodic. Now, I would say Michelle Obama is actually political, very political, even though, of course, her staff would say not. But I don't mean political in the sense of electoral politics or who's up and who's down in Washington, but political in the sense of having a very clear set of goals and ambitions and purposeful projects to accomplish something significant. And in that sense, I think she shows just how disciplined she is, again, to use Lys's word, and how very much goal and results oriented that she is. They share smarts, that's for sure too. I mean, there's, you know.
I think they're also both pretty private.
Absolutely.
You know, it's hard to get beyond the exterior with both of them unless you're very close to them. But Veronica,
Yes.
Thank you.
I knew you were going to have a question.
Well, I came in late, so if someone has already asked it or you've talked about it, I do apologize. And that is, did you get to meet with Michelle Obama at all? And if so, how much time did you spend with her? Secondly, have you read American Tapestry? Because in many ways, those kinds of ancestral ties and experience shape who you are. And Michelle Obama and her brother used to spend summers down there in the Low Country, and she is a descendant of people who were enslaved.
That is absolutely right. I not only have read American Tapestry, which is this wonderful book about Michelle's ancestry by Rachel Swarns.
Mm-hmm. And
but
she had Rachel Swan here
and
at
I was here
P&P.
for that. I
And
was just
Michelle
about to
Obama.
say that.
That's right. Yeah, I was here for that now. Mhm.
But I actually heard Rachel speak about the book right here, and I cite Rachel's work. Rachel's, like Gwen said, is also a good friend, and I cite her really terrific work in this book, going way, way back, for absolutely sure. As for spending time with Michelle Obama, I have not spent any time nor spoken with her since the first presidential campaign, when I interviewed her twice. They chose not to make her available for the book.
I can understand
So,
that.
and
Mhm.
yeah, I think their view is, we will tell our own story, thank you very much.
Mhm.
Now, I didn't want to write a book that was just completely on the outside. In fact, I wanted to write a book that would have her voice in it and to be as authentic to that voice as it could be, albeit as somebody who is not Michelle Obama, as you've noticed. So you will find her voice at the beginning with Anacostia and all the way through to the end, where I give her the last word at Maya Angelou's memorial service, for example, by drawing on, obviously not the interviews. I wasn't able to interview her in recent years, but I drew on lots and lots and lots of things she herself has said and tried to piece it together that way.
Well, maybe that will come. But I mean, if she wants to stay home and be a mom for two charming girls, that's okay too, because they're at a pivotal age. I know a lot of us are waiting for Hillary, but by the same token, she's earned every bit of free time that she gets. But thank you for mentioning racism, and to know that this is uppermost in my mind, because I share that ancestry as being a descendant. And I'll be going to the Low Country, in fact, where she's from on Wednesday. But now I didn't say I was related to Michelle Obama. I just said we share that history as descendants of people who were enslaved. And if you know your history, it shapes you without a doubt, because it has shaped your mother, your grandparents, and when she and her brother spent summers down there. But at any rate, thank you very much for mentioning the racism, because it's always the elephant in the room. And people, for whatever reason, don't mention it or talk about it. And you can't talk about Michelle Obama without talking about that. So I thank you for that.
You're very
and
welcome.
her experience
What
at
she said.
Princeton. Mhm.
Yes.
One last question.
Yes.
Yeah, I hope you've all seen the cover of the book. The question was, how did it come to be?
It's glorious, is it not? So
Well, she is glorious.
I can say that I had absolutely nothing to do with this picture. I wrote the book for a wonderful publisher, Alfred Knopf, where a terrific designer named Carol Devine Carson saw this this photo that came from a shoot that yielded other photos that have run elsewhere, and just simply found it charming. And I think one of the nice things about it is that you can bring to this picture, and for that matter to this book, your own thoughts, right? Because we all feel we have something to say and to think about Michelle Obama. And I think that's one of the beauties of having such great photos. There are actually a lot of photos on the inside too, is that we can look at those photos and project a little. And I hope that people can do a little bit of that with this book too, which I think can be read at a number of different levels. And we'll see. Thank you for listening.
I started off with Peter saying that I really admired anybody who would attempt to write a book about a first lady, let alone a sitting first lady. It's such a hard thing to do. You've done a great job. And I just want to say one last thing before we close. And by the way, because I will forget, if you haven't gotten a copy of the book, we have plenty up front, and he will sign them here. But one thing he did say beforehand was that he enjoyed every minute of working on this book, and given how hard it must have been to do, that is really a labor of love, and I think it shows in the final product. So thank you for being here. Thank all of you for being here.